The palace buzzed with activity as the day of the negotiations drew closer. The king, seated in his grand throne room, gazed out over his empire, the vastness of his power stretching across the stars. His mind was focused on one thing: the diplomat, Lyra, who would arrive soon. She had been sent to negotiate peace between his empire and an unknown alliance. At least, that's what he had been told. The king saw only an opportunity, a chance to assert his power even further. He had heard rumors of the diplomat's strength, whispers that she was more than just a negotiator. But the king dismissed them as mere stories, tales of legend. After all, who could challenge him? He was the ruler of all, and no one, not even the most powerful warriors, had ever dared to defy him. Lyra was just another pawn in his game, another face in the sea of diplomats who had come and gone over the years. She was no threat. He leaned forward, his fingers tapping lightly on the arm of his throne. He had already set his plans in motion. He would make the peace talks go wrong. He would have her killed. A quick assassination, a message to the alliance she represented, and everything would be back under his control. Simple, easy. His trusted officers were already in place. They had studied Lyra's every move, watched her arrive, and tracked her every step. She was being watched closely, unaware of the danger that loomed over her. The king had ordered a select group of his most skilled guards to be hidden in the grand hall where the talks would take place. Their mission: to kill the diplomat once the talks began. They were disguised as servants, aides, and diplomats themselves, blending in so well that Lyra would never suspect a thing. The king's plan was flawless in his mind. He would play the diplomat, pretend to engage in conversation, and then, when the time was right, give the signal. Lyra would fall. Her death would be swift, and no one would ever know the truth. His empire would remain secure, and the message would be clear to anyone who dared to challenge him. Peace talks were nothing but a charade, a means to an end. His enemies would be crushed, and his rule would remain unchallenged. Hours passed, and soon it was time. The grand hall where the talks were to take place stood quiet and still, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. Lyra was escorted into the room by a few of his lesser officers, their faces neutral but their hands twitching as they prepared for the orders to be given. The king stood at the head of the table, his eyes gleaming with calculated precision. He watched as Lyra entered, her calm, composed demeanor betraying no fear, no anxiety. She was a diplomat, yes, but something about her seemed different. An air of quiet confidence radiated from her that unsettled him, though he pushed the feeling aside. She greeted him with a small nod, her voice steady as she spoke. "Your Majesty, I am honored to be here. I hope that our negotiations will be fruitful for both our people." The king smiled, hiding the dark thoughts that twisted inside him. He offered her a seat across from him at the table, his mind already focused on the plan that was unfolding behind the scenes. The guards positioned around the room were ready. The signal would come soon. As the negotiations began, Lyra spoke carefully and eloquently, her words measured. But the king was barely listening, his attention focused on the guard who stood just behind her, waiting for the signal. He watched, calculating the perfect moment. It had to be fast, decisive. One wrong move and his entire empire could be at risk. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Minutes passed in tense silence as Lyra continued her talks. She seemed calm, unshaken by the pressure of the situation, but the king couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the diplomat's composure seemed too perfect. Something didn't sit right with him. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft cough from one of the officers standing by the door. It was the signal. The king's heart skipped a beat. He gave a small nod, and in that instant, the hidden guards moved swiftly into action. They stepped forward with weapons drawn, ready to strike. But Lyra was faster. Before the king could even react, she turned with unnatural speed, her eyes flashing with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. She reached out, her movements smooth and precise, and with one swift motion, disarmed the nearest guard. The room was plunged into chaos as the other guards lunged at her, but she was like a shadow, her body moving faster than their eyes could track. The king watched in stunned silence as Lyra incapacitated the guards with ease. There was no hesitation, no panic in her movements. She moved with a fluid grace, each strike calculated and efficient. Her opponents were taken down one by one, their weapons torn from their hands and their bodies sent sprawling to the ground. It was like watching a predator hunt. The king's heart pounded in his chest as he watched this unfold. How had she done this? How had she known? This wasn't a mere diplomat. It was something far more dangerous. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He had made a fatal mistake. The diplomat wasn't just here to talk peace. She wasn't even just a negotiator. She was something far darker, far more powerful than he could have ever imagined. Lyra was not only skilled in diplomacy, she was a warrior, a killer. His eyes widened as the pieces clicked together. She wasn't just anyone. She was the Baba Yaga, the legendary figure, the ghost story, the one that haunted nightmares. The king had thought he could manipulate her, control her, but now he understood. She wasn't here to negotiate. She was here to destroy him. Lyra turned to face him, her eyes cold, but there was no trace of anger, only a deep, calculating calm. "You underestimated me, Your Majesty," she said, her voice low and dangerous. The king's mouth went dry as he realized how deeply he had misjudged her. His once unshakable confidence crumbled in the face of her power. There was no escape now. He had made his move, and it had backfired. Now, Lyra stood before him, the hunter, and he, the prey. The king's mind raced, his thoughts whirling like a storm. He watched as Lyra effortlessly dispatched his elite guards one by one. The room, once filled with the heavy air of politics, now reverberated with the sounds of chaos. Clashing metal, grunts of pain, and the sickening thud of bodies hitting the cold marble floor. For the first time in his reign, the king felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Fear. He had underestimated her, thought her to be just another pawn, a mere diplomat with no strength of her own. But the woman standing before him was far from weak. The Baba Yaga. The name alone sent chills down his spine. His mind flashed to the old stories, the tales whispered in hushed tones by those who had survived encounters with her. But he had dismissed them as legends, the stuff of myth and superstition. Now here she was, standing in front of him, the embodiment of everything he had ignored. As Lyra continued to disarm his remaining guards with terrifying speed, the king felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had expected to control the situation, to bend her to his will, but now he was the one being controlled. His heart raced as his eyes darted around the room, searching for any way to escape, any way to regain control. But it was too late for that. The damage had been done. Lyra's eyes were cold, calculating, but there was no malice in them, only the quiet certainty of someone who had already won. She had made her move, and now there was no turning back. The guards who had been poised to strike her down now lay defeated at her feet, their weapons scattered across the floor. One by one, they had fallen, their bodies lying motionless, their eyes wide in shock and disbelief. None of them had stood a chance. The king's once proud empire had just been brought to its knees by a single woman, a woman he had underestimated, a woman he had thought he could control. But he was wrong. He had made a fatal error, and now he would pay the price. "Do you know who I am, Your Majesty?" Lyra's voice cut through the silence, her tone calm, almost eerily so. She didn't raise her voice, didn't need to. The power in her words was enough to make him tremble. The king swallowed hard, his mouth dry. His throat felt tight, as if he couldn't speak. He knew the answer to her question, but the words stuck in his throat. Baba Yaga. The name echoed in his mind, a name that had haunted the galaxy for centuries. The name of a woman who had single-handedly destroyed entire fleets, a woman whose mere presence was enough to strike terror into the hearts of the bravest warriors. But this was different. This wasn't a myth. This wasn't a story told around campfires. This was real. And he had made the worst mistake of his life by trying to kill her. Lyra took a step forward, her eyes never leaving his. Her expression remained unreadable, but the weight of her gaze was enough to make him feel as though he were being crushed beneath the weight of the universe. She moved with the grace of a predator, each step purposeful, each movement fluid and effortless. "Why did you think you could kill me?" she asked, her voice still calm, though there was a trace of something darker beneath the surface. "Did you think I wouldn't notice? Did you think you could trap me with your little games?" The king's eyes darted around the room, searching for any way out, any way to regain control of the situation. But there was nowhere to run, no way to escape the consequences of his actions. The very walls of his palace, once symbols of his power, now felt like a prison, trapping him in this moment of his own making. I didn't know who you were," the king stammered, his voice shaking. "I thought you were just a diplomat. I thought you were weak, like the others. I didn't know." Lyra stopped in front of him, her gaze never wavering. "That was your first mistake," she said softly. "You assumed. You thought you could control me, that I would be just another pawn in your game. But I am not like the others. I am not someone you can simply kill and forget about." The king's chest tightened as he realized the full extent of his mistake. He had thought that by killing her, he would send a message to the galaxy, that he would reaffirm his power and authority. But now, in this moment, it was clear that the message he had sent was one of weakness. He had miscalculated. He had chosen the wrong target. And now he would face the consequences. Lyra stepped closer, her presence overwhelming. The king felt small, insignificant in her shadow. She was no longer just a diplomat, no longer just a negotiator. She was a force of nature, a living legend, and he had angered her. "Your empire is built on lies, Your Majesty," she said, her voice cold and steady. "You've crushed those beneath you, ruled with fear and manipulation. But that ends now." The king's mind raced as he tried to think of a way to regain control. He had to do something, anything. But what? His soldiers were defeated. His guards were incapacitated. His palace was in chaos. There was no escaping the truth. He had made a mistake, and now he would pay for it. Lyra turned away, her back to him, as she surveyed the destruction she had wrought. "This is the price of underestimating someone like me," she said, almost to herself. "This is the cost of thinking you can control the unstoppable." The king's heart sank as he realized that she was right. There was nothing he could do. He had played his hand, and now he was at her mercy. The once mighty Galactic King, the ruler of a vast empire, stood before her, powerless, broken. "Please," he pleaded, his voice barely a whisper. "Spare me. I will do anything. I will make amends. Just, please don't destroy me." Lyra turned back to face him, her expression unreadable. She didn't answer immediately, but the silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of her decision. For a long moment, she studied him, her gaze piercing and unyielding. Finally, she spoke. "You had the chance to make peace, but you chose to destroy. And now you will face the consequences." With a final, cold look, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving the king to face the wreckage of his own making. The king remained rooted to his spot, frozen in disbelief. His mind struggled to grasp the reality of what had just happened. He had underestimated her. No, he had dismissed her. The diplomat he had planned to kill had torn through his guards like paper, a force beyond anything he could have imagined. And now she was gone, walking away from the ruin of his empire, leaving him to pick up the shattered pieces of his pride, his power, and his life. For a long while, the only sound that echoed through the grand hall was the soft, steady breathing of the king as he struggled to regain his composure. His once glorious palace, the symbol of his reign, now felt like a tomb. His empire, built on fear and conquest, was crumbling before his very eyes. He had thought he could control everything. But in that brief moment, He had lost it all. Outside the walls of his palace, word would soon spread of what had transpired. The news would travel fast, faster than any military fleet he had ever commanded. Lyra was no longer just a diplomat. She was the Baba Yaga, the living legend that had just destroyed the foundation of his power with a flick of her wrist. The galaxy would tremble, and his enemies would see this as a sign of weakness, of instability. He had made the worst possible mistake. The king sank into the throne, his head heavy with the weight of his failure. He had no allies left, no one to turn to. His trusted officers were either dead or cowering in fear, knowing that they, too, had played a part in his downfall. His grip on the galaxy had slipped away in the span of a few moments. And now, with Lyra's threat hanging over him, he wondered how long his reign would last. For the first time in years, he felt utterly powerless. The king's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. It was one of his remaining officers, a man who had once been a loyal servant, but now looked more like a shadow of the man he once was. The officer entered the room hesitantly, his eyes wary, as if afraid of what the king might do in his current state. "Your Majesty," the officer said, his voice trembling. "The palace is in chaos. The guards. What happened? We don't know what to do." The king looked at him through weary eyes, his heart sinking even further. "You don't know what to do," he repeated in disbelief. "You think this is just a matter of palace security." The officer flinched at the sharpness of the king's tone, but he remained silent, waiting for further orders. "Get out." The king spat suddenly, his voice hoarse. "There's nothing left to do. Go. Just go." The officer's eyes flickered with confusion, but he obeyed, turning and hurrying out of the room. The king was alone again, left to confront the enormity of his mistake. What could he possibly do now? What could anyone do? The realization sank in slowly. Lyra had not only defeated him, she had humiliated him. His empire, which had once been feared across the stars, was now the subject of ridicule. The very thought of it sent waves of anger and helplessness crashing through his chest. The king slammed his fist onto the arm of the throne, feeling the surge of frustration course through him. But as his fist hit the throne, something strange happened. He paused, his breath catching in his throat. He remembered something that had been buried in his mind for years, a memory he had long since locked away. The Baba Yaga. She wasn't just a name, a figure of terror and myth. She was something more. He had heard rumors, tales whispered by those who knew better, stories of the fear she instilled in those who crossed her path. But there had been something else in those stories, something more than her strength, her ruthlessness. She was a survivor. The realization hit him with the force of a starship collision. Lyra, the Baba Yaga, wasn't simply a diplomat, or a warrior, or a myth. She had lived through countless conflicts, countless betrayals. She had witnessed empires rise and fall, seen kings and generals come and go. She was a force of nature, a constant in a universe filled with chaos and destruction. The king had made the mistake of thinking that his empire, his position, would somehow make him invulnerable. He had treated her as just another piece in a game he controlled. But she had never been part of his game. She had been playing her own game all along. And now he had become a casualty in that game. Hours passed, and the king's mind churned with thoughts of retaliation. His mind was no longer consumed with thoughts of peace or diplomacy. He knew that the galaxy was watching, waiting for him to make his next move. But what could he do? Lyra had already struck. His forces were weak, scattered, and demoralized. His guards, his elite soldiers, those he had relied on to protect him, were all defeated, and his palace lay in ruins. The thought of gathering a counterattack seemed almost laughable. Lyra wasn't a force that could be overpowered. The king's first instinct had been to strike her down quickly, to remove her before she became a threat. But that was precisely what had led him to this moment, underestimating her. As he stood from the throne, his eyes drifted to the vast expanse outside the palace windows, where the stars stretched endlessly, just beyond his reach. Somewhere out there, Lyra, the Baba Yaga, was watching, waiting for his next move. She knew he would try to retaliate. And when he did, she would be ready. The king had one choice left. He could either surrender and hope to live out the remainder of his life in hiding, or he could make a final, desperate move. But in his heart, he knew that no matter what he chose, his empire was over. The galaxy had seen him for what he truly was, a king who had been undone by his own arrogance. The room fell silent once more, but the king's thoughts were louder than ever. The weight of the coming storm pressed down on him, and he wondered if there would be any survivors when it finally passed. The king's mind was a battlefield, every thought swirling with doubt, fear, and desperation. He had never faced an enemy like Lyra before. In all his years as ruler of the Galactic Empire, he had crushed countless rebellions, silenced the most powerful factions, and dominated his rivals with an iron fist. But now, for the first time, he felt truly powerless. As the hours stretched into a long, suffocating silence, the weight of his decision grew heavier with each passing moment. His advisors had scattered, his generals were too terrified to act, and his once mighty palace now felt like a prison. The king knew he could never return to the life he had once known. Lyra had shattered that illusion forever. The question was, what now? The king had made many enemies over the years, but none had ever dared strike at the heart of his empire as Lyra had. She wasn't just a diplomat. She was a force of nature, a living legend. She had played him, manipulated him into making a move that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The thought of retaliation gnawed at him, but he knew it was a futile hope. There was no army left to command, no allies left to call upon. His forces had been decimated, and his palace was in ruins. But there was one thing he still had, his pride. And that pride was all that kept him going. He had to do something, anything, to salvage his reputation, to remind the galaxy that he was still the king. Even if the empire was lost, even if he had no hope of winning, he could not allow himself to be humiliated further. In the darkened hall, the king paced back and forth, his thoughts racing. He had underestimated her, again. The legend of the Baba Yaga was not something to be taken lightly. She was no mere mortal. She was a being of immense power, a force who had lived through centuries of conflict, destruction, and betrayal. And she had just proven that she was more than capable of bringing down empires. As the king's thoughts swirled in confusion and rage, a quiet voice broke through the noise. "Your Majesty, the emissary from the Revar Alliance is here." The king turned to face his last remaining trusted officer, who had just entered the room, his voice trembling. The officer had barely been able to keep his composure after the chaos of the past few hours, but he was still loyal. The king nodded, though the bitterness of defeat weighed on him. He had little choice but to hear what the emissary had to say. The officer led the Revar representative into the dimly lit room. The emissary was a tall, imposing figure, draped in the ceremonial armor of his people. His face was a mask, expressionless and stern, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of wariness as he surveyed the wreckage around them. He, too, had heard the stories of Baba Yaga, though he likely didn't believe them. After all, the name of the Baba Yaga was not one often uttered in the halls of power. The emissary bowed slightly before speaking. "Your Majesty, I bring news from the Alliance. We have heard of the incident that took place here, and we have come to offer our assistance. We understand the gravity of your situation, and we believe we can help you reclaim your throne." The king's eyes narrowed as he regarded the emissary. He had expected this. The Revar Alliance had long been a thorn in his side, and now, in his moment of weakness, they saw an opportunity to capitalize on his downfall. But he was not in a position to refuse any offer, no matter how beneath him it might seem. "Help," the king scoffed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Do you think you can help me after what happened here? After the embarrassment I suffered at the hands of that woman?" The emissary's expression remained neutral, but the glint in his eyes suggested he wasn't about to back down. "We know you are angry, Your Majesty, but we also know that you are not a man to be easily defeated. The galaxy still fears you. The galaxy still believes in your strength. You have not lost everything. You only need to make the right moves." The king stood silent for a moment, his mind racing. The Revar Alliance was one of the few factions still holding any semblance of power in the galaxy. Aligning with them could give him the strength he needed to challenge Lyra and rebuild his empire, if he could get past the humiliation. But he was not foolish enough to think it would be easy. Lyra's wrath would be unforgiving, and the galaxy had already seen his weakness. "You believe you can help me," the king finally said, his voice cold and calculating. "Very well. Tell me what you propose." The emissary stepped forward, his voice low. "We can provide you with the resources you need to launch a counterattack, Your Majesty. But more importantly, we can offer you intelligence on Lyra's movements. The Revar have deep connections throughout the galaxy. We have spies, we have allies. We know where she has been, where she will be next." The king's eyes narrowed. This was tempting. Information was power, and if he knew where to strike, when to strike, it could give him the edge he so desperately needed. But trusting the Revar was a dangerous game. They were opportunists, always looking for a way to profit. He had been burned by their kind before. "I'll think about it," the king replied, his voice dripping with uncertainty. "But know this, if I do accept your offer, I expect no betrayal. I've already suffered enough humiliation. I won't stand for any more." The emissary bowed again, his eyes flickering with a hint of something the king couldn't quite place. "Of course, Your Majesty, we would never betray you." As the emissary left the room, the king was left with his thoughts. This was a turning point. His next decision would determine whether he would remain a ruler or fade into history as just another fallen king. But there was one thing he knew for certain: the game had changed. Lyra, the Baba Yaga, had thrown the first stone, and now it was his turn to retaliate. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be clean. But he would not go down without a fight. He would rebuild his empire, and he would make Lyra regret underestimating him. The king's path was set. The next chapter of this war had begun. The days that followed were filled with tension, as the king prepared for what could be his last chance to reclaim his throne. With the Revar Alliance's offer still hanging in the air, the king's mind wrestled with the weight of the decision. Could he trust them? Could he risk everything on a faction that had only ever been concerned with its own interests? Yet, in this fractured state of his empire, what other choice did he have? The king sat in his chambers, surrounded by a handful of his most trusted, and now his only, advisors. His palace, once a symbol of invincible power, felt more like a prison. The walls seemed to close in on him, their coldness reflecting the isolation he felt. His empire was nothing more than a distant memory now, fading into oblivion. But his resolve, as stubborn as ever, remained. He would not fall quietly. "Your Majesty," one of his remaining officers began, his voice thick with unease, "the Revar emissary awaits your decision. The moment to act is drawing near." The king clenched his fists, his mind flashing back to Lyra's victory. The image of her, calmly walking away as his palace burned behind her, haunted him. He could still feel the sting of his mistake. But now, in the quiet aftermath of his failure, the fire of vengeance burned hotter than ever. "Let them in," the king ordered, "and make it quick." Within moments, the Revar emissary entered the room, flanked by several other officials from the Alliance. They all wore expressions of professionalism, but there was something else in their eyes, an unmistakable hunger. They knew what the king needed, and they were more than willing to offer it to him, for a price. "Your Majesty," the emissary began, bowing respectfully, "we appreciate your time, and we are prepared to fulfill our agreement. We have compiled intelligence on Lyra's movements, as well as strategies for reclaiming your throne." The king barely acknowledged the emissary's words. He knew this was not the time for diplomacy. This was the time for action. "Give me the plan," the king said curtly, "and do not waste my time with promises. I need results. Now." The emissary nodded and spread out a holographic map on the table before the king, detailing Lyra's last known location and various strategic points. The map flickered with data, information about her movements, the places she had recently visited, and most importantly, her next potential target. "This is where we strike," the emissary said, his voice filled with confidence. "We know Lyra has been meeting with various factions, gathering allies. If we attack her at this location, we can catch her off guard. Her defenses will be spread thin. We can finish what you started, Your Majesty." The king stared at the map, his fingers brushing lightly over the coordinates. He could feel the weight of this moment in his bones. It was the perfect opportunity, or so it seemed, but there was a part of him that knew better than to believe it would be that easy. "We go for the strike," the king said coldly. "But remember, I trust no one but myself. If this fails, you will all pay for your betrayal." The emissary nodded quickly, his expression a mix of fear and ambition. "Of course, Your Majesty. You shall have everything you need. The attack will be swift." As the emissary and his allies filed out of the room, the king remained seated at the table, staring at the holographic map. A part of him felt the faintest flicker of hope. This was his chance to regain control, to prove that he still had power, that he could still command respect. The Revar had offered him the means to launch his counterattack, and now it was up to him to make it count. But as the door closed behind the emissary, a deeper sense of unease settled over the king. His mind raced, wondering what had brought Lyra to this moment. How had she known where to strike? How had she anticipated his every move? The fact that she had walked away unscathed from the attack that had destroyed his palace haunted him. She was a master strategist, and he could feel her watching, waiting for him to make his next move. He had underestimated her before, and he couldn't afford to make that mistake again. The days passed slowly, the tension mounting with every hour. The king's forces, though weak and scattered, had been reassembled. The palace was rebuilt, though in a form less grand and more functional. The king's officers and advisors had gathered, their faces grim as they prepared for what could very well be the last stand of their empire. As the appointed hour of the attack grew nearer, the king stood at the balcony of his chambers, staring out into the dark expanse of space. The stars glittered coldly, indifferent to the struggles of those below. Somewhere out there, Lyra was waiting. He could feel it, as if the very universe itself had aligned against him. She was the hunter now, and he was the prey. He turned from the balcony, his mind made up. The attack would proceed as planned. He had to strike first, take the initiative before Lyra could retaliate. His pride demanded it. His empire demanded it. But as he walked toward the command center, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. The Revar had given him the means to fight back, but could they be trusted? The galaxy was full of lies and betrayal. What if the Revar were playing him, using his need for vengeance to further their own agenda? Before he could contemplate it any longer, a sharp voice broke through his thoughts. "Your Majesty, Lyra is here." The king's heart skipped a beat. She had arrived earlier than he expected. She had found him, and now the moment of truth had arrived. The king stood frozen, a rush of emotions flooding through him. Anger, fear, regret, and something else, something darker. He had made his choice. The attack would begin. But now, facing the inevitable confrontation, he could feel it. The end was near. Whether he would emerge victorious, or whether Lyra would once again reduce him to nothing, was a mystery even he couldn't answer. The only thing that was certain was that there would be no turning back. The final battle had begun.